All right, let's jump right into a really big and honestly a pretty misunderstood idea, postmodernism. We're going to take a look at how this way of thinking really challenges the huge, foundational stories that have shaped our world for a long, long time. So let me start by asking you this. Just think about all the big ideas you've grown up with. You know, the story that history is always getting better, that your country has some special destiny, or that science will eventually have an answer for everything. But what if those giant stories aren't the complete picture? What if there's more to it? To even begin to answer that, we have to get right to the heart of postmodernist thought. And it all really kicks off with the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard and this game-changing concept he called metanarratives. And this right here, this single sentence is pretty much his entire definition of postmodernism. That's it. Incredulity towards metanarratives. It basically means a deep, profound skepticism, a kind of refusal to just blindly accept the big, all-encompassing stories we're fed. So what in the world is a metanarrative? I know, it sounds super academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It's a grand story. Think of it like a story to end all stories, a massive explanation that claims it has the universal truth for every single person, everywhere, for all time. And modern societies, well, they loved these things to justify their own power and their version of the truth. And I guarantee you've run into these before. For example, the idea that history is just this constant upward march of progress, that's a classic metanarrative. Or the idea that one specific religion holds the key to explaining all of reality, yep, that's one too. The same goes for huge political theories like Marxism, the powerful story of a nation's unique identity, or even the idea that science and only science holds all the objective truth. Okay, so that leads to the really big question, right? If these stories were so powerful, if everyone seemed to believe them, why did they start to crack? Why did this deep skepticism start to creep in? Well, the postmodern critique argues that the problem is baked right into these grand narratives because they claim to be the one and only true story. They're totalizing, meaning they try to cram everyone and everything into a single box, and in doing so, they silence anyone who's different. That makes them exclusionary, right? They push some people's experiences to the side while holding others up. And ultimately, they often become tools of power, used to control what people think and how they act. And look, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate. The 20th century provided some pretty brutal, real-world proof. These grand narratives of progress and national destiny and ideological purity, they didn't lead to some utopia. Instead, they were used to justify things like world wars, genocide, and colonialism. These horrifying events absolutely shattered the faith that any single grand story could ever deliver on its promise of universal truth and justice for all. So, if the grand narratives failed us, are we just left with nothing? Just chaos? Well, not at all. Postmodernism isn't just about tearing things down. It actually proposes a really interesting alternative by shifting our focus from the massive to the specific. So instead of that one single universal story that claims to speak for everybody, postmodern thought champions what Lyotard called petit récits, or, little narratives. It's a fundamental shift from the universal to the personal. So what are these little narratives? Well, they're basically everything the grand narratives ignored. They're the local stories, the personal experiences, the voices that were drowned out. They're the perspectives from the margins. So instead of one big neat picture, you get this beautiful, complex mosaic made up of all these different, fragmented, but totally valid points of view. Now, as you can imagine, this completely changes the definition of truth itself. In a postmodern world, there's no single center, no absolute bedrock to stand on. Truth isn't this universal, eternal thing anymore. It becomes contextual. It depends on the situation. It's provisional, meaning it's always open to being revised. And maybe most importantly, it's plural. There isn't just one truth. There are many. Okay, let's zoom out for a second and just look at the big picture. What does this huge fundamental shift in thinking really look like when we put it all together? This chart breaks it down perfectly. The modern way of thinking, which really came out of the Enlightenment, was all about that search for universal truth, for total explanations, and for a feeling of certainty. It respected authority and was always aiming for unity. Postmodernism, on the other hand, it values local truths, it's comfortable with fragmented stories, it embraces skepticism, it encourages us to question authority, and it actually celebrates difference. And this right here really gets to the core of it all, and it's something that gets misunderstood all the time. Postmodernism is not about destroying meaning or saying that nothing is true. Think of it more like a kind of intellectual democracy. It simply denies the right of any one story, any one meta-narrative, to have a complete monopoly on meaning and truth for every single person. And that really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If those grand stories of progress or destiny don't really capture the full picture, then what does? What's the personal, local, little narrative that tells the story of your experience, your community, your world? It's a really good question to ask yourself. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. You know, we all think we know the classics, right? But what if the story you've always heard is really only one side of the coin? What if all those silent characters, the ones kind of pushed to the edges of the page, suddenly got to grab the microphone and tell their own story? Well, today, that's exactly what we're looking at. How a group of authors decided to rewrite literary history, not by changing the ending, but by completely changing who gets to be the storyteller. Mad, animalistic, silent. These three words were used to describe one of the most famous and most silenced characters in all of literature, Bertha Mason. You know her, the so-called mad woman in the attic from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Honestly, she's less of a character and more of a plot device, right? She's this terrifying secret that's just standing in the way of Jane and Rochester's happiness. Her story isn't her own, it's told about her, boiling her entire existence down to just a few scary adjectives. Of course not. And that's the big question, isn't it? Is that really the whole story? What happens when another writer comes along and decides that this silent obstacle actually deserves a voice, a history, and a story all her own? And that's where Jean Rhys and her absolutely brilliant 1966 novel, Wide Sargasso Sea, come in. Now, this isn't a sequel or fan fiction. It's a prequel. It's a total reimagining of history that takes us all the way back to the Caribbean to meet the woman before she was locked away in that cold English attic. And just look at this radical transformation. Rhys doesn't just give her a backstory. She gives her back her real name, Antoinette. Suddenly, she's not a silent object of horror anymore. She's the narrator of her own life. And maybe most important of all, her state of mind is completely reframed. She isn't just mad, she's profoundly traumatized. Now, this act of rewriting is a classic move straight out of the postmodern playbook. It's all about challenging what philosophers call grand narratives. These are the big, sweeping, often unquestioned stories that societies tell themselves. You know, stories like the idea that colonialism was some kind of civilizing force, or that patriarchy is just the natural, rational way of the world. Well, Rhys's novel takes a sledgehammer to those ideas. Okay, so let's get to the real heart of it. How exactly does Wide Sargasso Sea challenge the very idea of madness itself? The novel makes this powerful argument that Antoinette's state isn't some inherent flaw in her character, but a direct result of what was done to her. The book totally rejects this grand narrative of rationalism. It goes against that old-fashioned idea that you can just label someone mad, like it's a simple medical diagnosis, while completely ignoring all the social and political forces that are absolutely crushing them. So Rhys basically shows us the recipe for making a mad woman. First step, you have cultural dislocation. Antoinette is a Creole heiress, but she's never fully accepted by the white English colonizers or the formerly enslaved Black Jamaicans. She's stuck in the middle. Then comes the patriarchal betrayal. Her new English husband, Rochester, takes all her money, controls her body, and even strips her of her identity by renaming her Bertha. And the final ingredient? Total isolation. He drags her to England and locks her away in a cold, gray attic, a psychological prison that's the complete opposite of her vibrant Caribbean home. Her breakdown isn't the cause of her problems, it's the result. This question, which Antoinette asks herself in the novel, it's the heartbreaking center of everything. It perfectly captures her fragmented identity. She's a person who's been literally torn apart by colonialism, racism, and sexism, and she's left with no real sense of self or belonging. Now, this technique of pulling a character from the margins of a story and putting them right in the center is a really powerful postmodern pattern. And you know what? Jean Rhys wasn't the only one doing it. Let me give you two other great examples that show this pattern in action. You've got J.M. Coetzee's novel Foe, which retells Robinson Crusoe, but it focuses on a new female character and a voiceless Friday to ask, hey, who really gets to write history? Then there's Tom Stoppard's play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which takes two tiny characters from Hamlet and makes them the confused stars of their own story. In every case, the strategy is the same. Flip the perspective and you realize that truth is never as stable as you thought. And this isn't just about writing clever fan fiction. These authors are making a really profound philosophical point. They're basically saying that what we call history or truth, it isn't some solid objective thing. It's a story. And stories can always be retold. Okay, so let's bring this all home. Why does this literary technique matter so much? I mean, what's the ultimate goal of going back and rewriting these classic tales? We've seen the whole postmodern toolkit in action, haven't we? These authors reject those big, sweeping truths. They decenter the traditional hero to show us other points of view. They actively go looking for the voices from the margins and give them the spotlight. And by doing all that, they show us that meaning isn't fixed at all. It's slippery, it's unstable, and it totally depends on who is holding the microphone. This right here is the essential takeaway. Postmodernism argues that there is no one single capital T truth. Instead, there are lots of little t truths. And these truths are always local, they're always changing, and, this is the big one, they are always shaped by structures of power. The most important question you can ask is, who has the power to tell the story? And this is why this all matters so much, way beyond your English class. This isn't just some clever game for authors to play. It's a really powerful tool for critical thinking. It teaches us that history, the way we know it, is usually just one version of events, and it's almost always the version told by the winners. By rewriting these fictional stories, these authors are giving us permission to question all the stories we've been told. So, I'm going to leave you with this question to think about, whether it's in history or something you saw in the news or even in your own life. What story have you always just accepted as the final word? And what might happen if you tried, just for a second, to imagine it from a completely different point of view?
You know, we've all grown up with stories. We kind of expect them to have a neat beginning, a clear middle, and a satisfying end, right? But what happens when a story just throws that whole map away? Well, that's what we're diving into today. We're going to deconstruct the art of the broken story. So let me ask you this. Does every single story really need that clean A to B to C structure to make sense? Or is that just a habit we've gotten into? This is the exact question a whole new wave of writers started asking. And believe me, their answers completely changed the game. All right, here's the plan. We're going to start with what we all know, then look at the toolkit these writers used to tear it all down. We'll dig into two incredible case studies, figure out the why behind it all, and land on the main event. This idea of the illusion of wholeness.
Okay, so for like centuries, Western stories have followed the same basic blueprint. You've got your beginning, rising action, a big climax, and then everything gets tied up in a neat little bow. It's all cause and effect. And honestly, it's comfortable. It gives us this feeling that the world makes sense. But what if life isn't neat? I mean, really, when is it ever that simple? What if our experiences are messy and chaotic and just don't follow a straight line? Well, that's exactly where postmodernism crashes the party. It takes that blueprint and just rips it to shreds, all to show us a world that feels a lot more unstable and uncertain.
So if you're going to toss out the old rule book, you're going to need some new tools, right? Postmodern authors basically created a brand new toolkit for building these broken stories. And there's one tool in particular that's at the very heart of the whole thing. And that technique is fragmentation. So instead of a smooth, flowing river of a story, you get these pieces. Little broken bits of narrative, timelines that jump all over the place, and a bunch of different voices that might even contradict each other. It's kind of like making a mosaic instead of painting a straight line.
And you can really see the difference here. Over on one side, you've got that classic linear model, clear plot, a character who makes sense, all that good stuff. But postmodernism? It says no thanks. Instead, you get these fragmented structures. You're jumping between different characters' heads, and timelines might even loop back and start over. It's a totally different way of building a story from the ground up.
Let's see how this actually works. Our first case study is Joseph Heller's masterpiece, Catch-22. Now, this book isn't just about things being absurd. The whole way it's built, its structure, is absurd. This right here is the heart of the book's logic. The famous Catch-22 is this perfect, inescapable loop of bureaucratic madness. You can't get out, because the only way out is to ask, and asking proves you don't need a way out. The story itself works just like this. Events repeat themselves, things don't add up, and it all loops back, trapping you, the reader, in the same crazy logic as the characters. And this is so important.
This isn't just some clever literary trick. Heller's fragmentation serves a massive purpose. It makes you feel the psychological chaos of being at war. It shows you that war isn't some grand heroic story. It's absurd, it's bureaucratic, and when things get truly insane, all our neat, rational explanations just completely fall apart.
Now for our second case study, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which takes this whole fragmentation idea to another level. Vonnegut doesn't just break up the plot, he breaks time itself. The main character, Billy Pilgrim, has become unstuck in time. So as you can see, his life doesn't happen in order. He's constantly jumping around. One minute he's a prisoner of war, the next he's an optometrist years later, and then, he's an exhibit in an alien zoo. And the most traumatic moment of his life, the bombing of Dresden, is this point he keeps getting pulled back to over and over in these scattered pieces. And here's the kicker. Every single time death is mentioned in the book, whether it's one person or a whole city, the narrator just says, "So it goes." That's it. This flat, constant repetition just sucks all the grand meaning and emotion right out of tragedy. It's like a verbal shrug in the face of absolute horror. And that is the absolute genius of what Vonnegut did. He's showing us that trauma isn't a neat story. It doesn't have a clean arc. It shatters our sense of time, our sense of continuity. You can't wrap it up in a simple, linear explanation. And the book's fragmented structure makes you understand that on a deep gut level.
Okay, so we've seen what fragmentation is and how it works, but why? Why did this start happening? Well, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a response to some huge shifts happening in philosophy, in theory, and in the world itself.
So you had thinkers like Jean-François Lyotard, who basically said that the big, simple stories societies tell themselves, he called them grand narratives, had just fallen apart. Then you have guys like Jacques Derrida, showing how language itself is slippery and meaning is never really fixed. And you mix all that with the actual lived experience of a world recovering from world wars, dealing with trauma, and being bombarded by mass media, and suddenly, fragmentation doesn't seem like an artistic choice. It seems like the only honest way to reflect reality. And that brings us to the final and I think most important idea. It's really easy to look at all this brokenness, this chaos, and think the point is just to be confusing or to say that nothing means anything. But that's not it. Not at all. The real point is to ask where meaning actually comes from.
This is the absolute core of it. Postmodernism isn't saying there's no meaning, it's saying that meaning was never this perfect, complete thing that's just handed to us. No, meaning is something we make. It's temporary, it's incomplete, and it's something that we build ourselves by piecing together all the broken fragments we have. It doesn't come from some grand cosmic blueprint.
And if you take away one thing from this, let it be this. These authors aren't trying to confuse or destroy meaning. They're trying to expose the comfortable lie that meaning was ever simple or whole in the first place. The mess isn't the problem. The mess is the whole point. We find the meaning inside the mess.
So I'll leave you with this to chew on. Think about your own life, your own memories. Is your story a straight line from beginning to end? Or is it maybe a little more like Billy Pilgrim's life, a collection of vivid, jumbled up fragments that you are constantly piecing together to make sense of it all? Thanks for joining me.
All right, let's talk about a big, kind of tricky idea, postmodernism. And you know what? We're going to do it by diving into one of the wildest, most important books ever written, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. So how does a weird novel about aliens and war explain a massive philosophical movement? Well, let's find out. Okay, first things first, I want you to picture a war hero. You know the type, right? From the movies, from history books. What do you see? Someone strong, decisive, maybe a little rugged. Someone with a clear mission. Got that image in your head? Okay, hold that thought. Because now, let's meet the guy Vonnegut came up with instead. And here he is, Billy Pilgrim. I mean, just look at this comparison. On one side, you've got everything we just pictured. Strong, in control, the hero. And on the other side, you've got Billy. He's weak. He's passive. He's just a confused guy who stuff happens to. He's not driving the story is driving him. And that right there is what makes him the perfect postmodern anti-hero. So you might be thinking, wow, this guy sounds like a terrible hero. But that's the whole point. He's not supposed to be a hero. He's an anti-hero. See, postmodernism kind of looks at our chaotic world and says, hey, you know that idea of the one strong person who can fix everything? That's a myth. It's a nice story, but it's not real. Billy's complete and utter lack of heroism? That's the entire message. Okay, so to really get a grip on an anti-hero like Billy, we have to look at the world he lives in. And let me tell you, his reality isn't just a little bit broken, it's been smashed into a million tiny pieces. And this line right here, this is the master key to the whole novel. Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. Think about that. He doesn't live his life A, then B, then C, like the rest of us. Nope. He's like a channel surfer with a broken remote, just zapping randomly through the moments of his own life. It's not that the story is out of order. For Billy, order doesn't even exist. And this is what that chaos actually looks like. I mean, 1 minute, it's 1945, and he's surviving one of the worst bombings in history. Zap, now it's 1967, and he's an old optometrist. Zap, oh, now he's a little kid learning to swim. And then, zap, he's in a zoo on another planet. Yeah, that happens. A normal hero's story is a straight line, an arrow moving forward. Billy's story? He's a pinball, just ricocheting off the different moments of his life. So why would anyone write a story this way? Is it just to be weird? No, not at all. It's what we call a trauma narrative. Think about it. The jumbled, confusing structure perfectly captures what it feels like to live with PTSD. If you've gone through something horrific, like Billy did in Dresden, your memory isn't a nice, neat movie. It's a bunch of broken pieces that can jump out at you at any time in any order. That's what this book feels like. Okay, so we've got a broken reality. That's layer one. But now we get to the next, even more mind-bending postmodern layer. The book itself knows that it's a book. It's constantly winking at you, the reader, and reminding you, hey, this isn't real. You're reading a story that I made up. And this leads us to a fancy-sounding term, but stick with me, because the idea is actually pretty simple. Historiographic metafiction. Big words, I know. But all it means is that the book mixes real history, the very real, very horrific bombing of Dresden, with a totally made-up story about Billy Pilgrim. And the reason it does that is to make you wonder, what really is the difference between a history textbook and a novel? Aren't they both just stories, put together by an author with a specific point of view? And then, just when you're getting lost in the story, Vonnegut does something absolutely wild. He shows up. In the book. He literally writes himself into a scene and says, yep, that little guy over there, that was me, the author. Bam. The fourth wall doesn't just get broken, it gets demolished. The whole illusion that this is a real story just goes up in smoke. And it's not a one-time thing. He does this constantly. The very first chapter of this war novel isn't even about the war. It's about him, Kurt Vonnegut, trying and failing to write the book. He mashes up sci-fi and war stories in his own life. It's all designed to keep you, the reader, on your toes, to constantly remind you you are reading a constructed thing, all of it. History, memory, novels, it's all just someone's version of the story. So let's recap. We have a broken reality. We have a story that admits it's a story. Where does that leave us? Well, it leads us to the final, and maybe the most challenging idea in the whole book, the total collapse of meaning. If everything is just a jumble and all the stories are made up, then what's the point of anything? There's this idea in postmodernism called grand narratives. They're the big, comforting stories societies tell themselves. You know, wars for a noble cause, hard work always pays off, history is always moving forward and getting better. They make us feel good. Well, Slaughterhouse-Five takes a sledgehammer to every single one of those ideas. In Vonnegut's world, war isn't heroic, it's just stupid and absurd. And history isn't progress, it's just chaos. So if you can't rely on those big, easy answers, what's left? What do you do? Well, for Vonnegut, there's only one thing you can do in the face of absolute horror. You embrace the absurdity of it all, and you develop a really, really dark sense of humor. And the way the book does this is kind of chilling. It flattens everything out. So you get a description of a man being shot for stealing a teapot, and then the complete destruction of a city with 100,000 people, and then a bottle of champagne going flat. And all of it is described with the same flat, emotionless tone. It's like nothing matters more than anything else. And after every single one of these deaths, big or small, he uses the same 3 little words. Yep, so it goes. It's repeated over 100 times. A soldier dies? So it goes. Billy's dog dies? So it goes. That flat bottle of champagne? So it goes. It basically becomes this great equalizer. It strips death of all its drama and meaning. It's the ultimate shrug in the face of the universe. It's not heroic, it's not tragic, it just is. Things happen, and that's that. And this all builds to the final breakdown, the breakdown of language itself. I mean, really, after you've seen something like the firebombing of Dresden, what words are there? What can you possibly say that would make any sense of it? The book's answer is simple: nothing. There are no words. Language, the thing we use to create meaning, just completely and utterly fails. Which is why the entire book ends with this. Putiwit? That's it. That's the last line. Not some deep thought about the human condition, just a bird sound, a sound with absolutely no meaning. Because after everything, that's all that's left to say. Nothing. So here's the thing to walk away with. Slaughterhouse-Five is not a bad war story. It's a perfect story about why it's impossible to write a traditional heroic war story anymore. It uses this bumbling anti-hero and this totally shattered timeline, not to try and explain war, but to show you, to make you feel in your gut why some things are, in the end, completely unexplainable.